The pulmonary circuit is designed to carry blood to the lungs, right, for gas exchange. The systemic circuit is designed to carry oxygen-rich blood to all the tissues of your body. So, we identified these two chambers up here, which are called what? Atria, and below them are ventricles, okay? And we call the atrias the receiving chambers, right? Because those are the ones that are the receiving blood from the body or from the lungs, and the ventricles are the pumps, okay? Which is why the ventricles are lined with thick layers of what? What layer is this? Myocardium, right? Thick layers of myocardium. Okay, so what are these guys that empty into the right atrium? Superior and inferior vena cava. And you can't see it here, but there would be a little opening for a vein that empties the heart itself as an organ. What is that vein called? Coronary sinus. Okay, so you got 3 vessels there. So blood enters the heart in the right atrium, and it goes through what structure? The tricuspid valve, which is also called the right atrioventricular valve. And those valves attach to strings called? No, the strings first. Think of cords. Chordae tendineae, and those attach to bumps called papillary muscles. Now, all the involutions in the ventricles themselves are called trabeculae carni. Okay, so then blood enters the right ventricle, and it goes through what structure? Pulmonary semilunar valve, and it enters the pulmonary trunk, and then it goes down the left and the right pulmonary arteries. Okay, and arteries by definition do what? Carry blood away from the heart. So since they're pulmonary arteries, they're carrying blood where? To the lungs. Okay, for gas exchange. So gas exchange happens in the capillaries, pulmonary capillaries, and blood comes into the left atrium via the right and left pulmonary veins. And veins by definition do what? Carry blood back to the heart, right? Okay. So then blood goes from the left atrium through the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve or the left atrioventricular valve, which is attached to these strings called chordae tendineae, and these bumps are papillary muscle and brings blood into the left ventricle. Okay, good. So then blood from the left ventricle goes through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. Okay? Now, in adding to our picture from yesterday, I'll just write it directly on this picture right here, but you can add to the diagram that we were drawing yesterday. There are 3 main branches off the aorta, and we're going to get to those in lab, okay? But I'm going to just mention them now so that you have them in your notes. The first branch is called the brachiocephalic trunk. The second branch is the left common carotid artery. And the third branch is the left subclavian artery. Okay. So the brachiocephalic trunk. Brachiocephalic. Brachio means what? Arm. Cephalic is of or pertaining to the head, right? So the brachiocephalic trunk is a trunk, so it is going to branch like a tree trunk, and it's actually going to give you the right common carotid and the right subclavian on the right side of the head and neck. So these first 3 branches, the common carotids go up your neck and feed your brain. Okay, so the carotids go through what opening in the skull? Carotid canal. They feed your brain. And then subclavian vessels, what does sub mean? Below. And then what does this sound like? Clavicle. Okay, so it's going to go below the clavicle and feed your extremities, your upper extremities. So these three branches off the aorta feed your head, your neck, and your upper extremities. Okay, so the first three branches take care of all of that. All right. Okay, perfect. So blood courses through the aorta, it shoots up the first three branches, takes care of the head, the neck, left and right upper extremity, and then shoots down and goes into the thorax and into the abdominal pelvic region and feeds the rest of the body. Okay? Okay, fantastic. Any questions about the circuits or what we drew or anything at all about the heart? Okay. I find the heart fascinating. I think it's really interesting and it's fun. I mean, it's like two different circuits. PowerPoint's nice. It's almost hard not to talk about when you talk about the cardiovascular system. So they're basically the organs that allow blood to carry oxygen and nutrients to your tissues and also to the lungs for exchange. So your blood vessels rely on pressure, okay? Pressure in order to push blood through the tubes, essentially, okay? So, I mean, this is just a schematic of the body, but we all know the heart's not a square, but we know that blood from the heart, okay, leaves via arteries, so away. It goes into, okay, specific arteries, and this is just a summary slide. We're going to go over each one of these. So from arteries, it's going to go into elastic arteries. It's going to enter muscular arteries, okay? And then from there, it's going to enter smaller arteries called arterioles. And arterioles are smaller in diameter because arterioles are getting closer to capillaries. And we know now that capillaries are the smallest blood vessels in the body. And this is where exchange happens. Okay, so we got to slow the flow. So the diameter is getting smaller. Meta-arterioles, okay, are basically immediate branches off the arteriole that directly feed into a capillary bed, of which we meet the capillaries. And then once exchange happens, blood can be shunted through what's called a thoroughfare channel. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And the thoroughfare channel then shunts that blood into small veins, which then course, again, they converge and merge, okay, into larger veins, which then bring that blood back to the heart. Okay, and then you just start the cycle all over again. All right? Okay, so let's take each one and kind of just identify the important characteristics. Before I forget, under the blood vessel PowerPoint, there is a handout, okay? That handout asks you to compare and contrast arteries and veins, okay? Compare and contrast arteries and veins, all right? It's a good handout. Okay, so arteries, we know, branch and diverge, okay? They take blood away from the heart, nothing new here. Generally oxygen rich, but you can't say that they all are, right? Because we know pulmonary arteries carry oxygen poor blood to the lungs for gas exchange. And umbilical arteries we'll identify later in fetal circulation. That's another exception, but we'll talk about that later. So, the walls of arteries have three layers, which we call tunics. Okay, the innermost layer is called the tunica intima, and that's a sheet of simple squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, so that's what blood is just directly coming into contact with when it's flowing and coursing through an artery. Superficial to that, we have tunica media, which are circular sheets of smooth muscle around the diameter of the vessel, and that allows the vessel to vasodilate or vasoconstrict based on pressure. Okay. All right, and then superficial to that, we have a layer of connective tissue, of course, to give the organ structural stability, give it its shape. Okay, and those collagen and elastin fibers are arranged in a longitudinal arrangement because that's the way blood vessels orient themselves. They are tubes. Okay, so with structure comes function. Okay, so in the picture, you can see the tunica media here in an artery is quite thick. It's quite thick. Okay, versus in a vein. The tunica media is not as thick, so we'll talk about veins shortly. You can also see here, what's the difference in the diameter between an artery and a vein?
Vein is bigger.
Veins are bigger, okay? Veins are bigger because their only job is to bring blood where? Back to the heart. That's their only job, right? Arteries have to take blood everywhere. They have to take blood to all the organs, all the tissues, all of the cells. So they have a larger job. Veins do not, okay? And this is basically just showing you what a capillary looks like from the inside. Just a single layer of simple squamous epithelial tissue. We'll get to that in a minute. We already know that that's called endothelium. Okay, so blood enters arteries, and we have two different kinds of arteries in the body. The first kind of artery is called an elastic artery, and the big arteries near the heart are these kind of arteries. So the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary trunk arteries, okay? So what happens, or the difference between elastic and muscular arteries, is that elastic arteries have elastic fibers filtered throughout their tunics. So all three tunics have elastic fibers in them, okay? There's even more in the tunica media, okay? And what that does is that allows for those large arteries to accept the tremendous amount of pressure of blood that's being pumped into them from the ventricles. Okay, so the aorta is an elastic artery. It's accepting a tremendous force of blood through it from the left ventricle. So it has to be able to expand and accept that blood from the left ventricle without bursting, right? So it does that because elastic fibers are filtered throughout and are especially in the tunica media, where the muscle tissue is, that allow it to stretch and then recoil back to its original position, okay? Okay. Muscular arteries are smaller and they're closer to organs, so they supply the organs, okay? So they have elastic fibers also, but their elastic fibers tend to gather around the circumference of the vessel so that the vessel can control its diameter. It can either vasodilate and give the organ a lot, or it can vasoconstrict and give the organ restricted amounts. So it allows for a little bit more control. Okay. So muscular arteries are also called distributing arteries just because they're distributing blood to all the different organs in the body, but we'll know them as muscular. Okay. Okay. So from there then, blood's going to enter small arteries. Small arteries are called arterioles. Now arterioles, the diameter goes way down, so we call these resistance arteries because there's a lot of pressure in these structures, okay? So, in this picture here, we've got two different scenarios, okay? Two different capillary beds in two different parts of the body, okay? So, coming off of an arteriole, okay, is what we call a meta-arteriole, okay? So meta-arterioles come right off of an arteriole right at the point of a capillary bed, okay? And meta-arterioles can allow blood to enter that capillary bed. It's like the entrance highway into a capillary bed off of an arteriole is the meta-arteriole. What we also have though are what are called precapillary sphincters. And a sphincter in the body is an opening that can open or close, okay? So precapillary sphincters, depending on whether or not that particular part of the body needs blood at that moment, precapillary sphincters can either open and let blood fill the capillary bed for exchange, or they can choose to close and shunt blood straight through a capillary bed directly into the venous system, okay? So for example, this is basically monitored by, we talked about sympathetic and parasympathetic division, so it's monitored by the nervous system. Who's in control at the moment, okay? So for example, if the parasympathetic nervous system is in control, like right now where you guys are sitting here listening to lecture, we said that that's rest and digest, right? So that's when you're just chilling, maybe you just had a protein shake or something, and you're digesting what it is you just had, okay? So this scenario here then, where you're letting blood flood the capillaries, okay? Precapillary sphincters are wide open, okay? is probably going to be a scenario located where in the body, if you just had a protein shake and you're digesting it. Like in your stomach, for example, or your digestive organs, your small intestine, your large intestine, because you're digesting. So that's promoting increased circulation to that area so that you can absorb the nutrients, so that the capillaries can allow for exchange. Pull out the proteins, pull out the carbs, pull out the lipids that you need. Versus, for example, maybe your skeletal muscle in your body. You're not really doing anything right now. Your skeletal muscles don't really have this burning desire to get oxygen in order to start contraction. So, blood doesn't need to go there, so why don't we just shunt it back into the venous system and it'll go through the cycle and come out and come back in and go to where it's needed the most. Okay, so this is just an example of how these precapillary sphincters can control whether or not blood enters a capillary bed in a certain area of the body depending on need. So if, for example, the sympathetic division is in control, say you're going to the gym, okay, you're going to the gym, you're getting on the Stairmaster, right, you're not digesting at that moment, so your digestive organs are probably going to look like this. And your skeletal muscles are probably going to look like this. Because now you're giving demand to that part of the body. And so it switches up. So it allows for control, which is kind of cool. So if a meta-arteriole, okay, if the precapillary sphincters are closed, the meta-arteriole will shunt blood into what's called a thoroughfare channel. So a thoroughfare channel lives on the venous side of the capillary bed, kind of after exchange has happened. And the thoroughfare channel is what leads the blood into the venous system. Okay. Okay. So again, same picture. Again, arteries leading in, veins leading out. Okay. Exchange happens at the level of the capillary, which is why there's only a single layer of epithelial cells. This promotes diffusion. So oxygen is going to want to just leave. CO2 is going to want to go in, going down their concentration gradients. Okay. Nutrients are going to want to leave. Okay, because more likely than not your tissues need nutrients, so you're going to have a higher concentration of nutrients in your capillaries, which is going to drive them out into your tissues. Okay. Okay, so smallest blood vessel in the body then is capillaries, but the most important because again, this is where exchange happens. So it's exchange of ions, nutrients, wastes, all the stuff that we need to take in and get rid of. The walls of capillaries, we'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, have gaps in them that can allow for exchange. And there are cells that live on top of the capillaries that are called pericytes, and they basically preserve the capillary bed. Okay, they're maintaining the anatomical structure of the capillary bed to make sure everything's functioning properly because capillaries are super important and we have over 1 billion of them. So this is really cool. This is like a skeletal muscle slide. All right, so you got a skeletal muscle fiber here and there's a capillary going over one of the fibers. And the capillary, the diameter of the capillary is so small that blood cells, red blood cells, you can see erythrocytes there, can only go through it single file. That's a single file line of red blood cells. That's how small capillaries are, right? So there's a tremendous amount of resistance in capillaries because the diameter is so small. But that promotes exchange, okay? The bottom is kind of just a more cartoonized kind of rendition of a single file line of red blood cells pushing through a capillary. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 different types of capillaries that we have in the body. And when we talk about capillaries, we're talking about leakiness, right? Because this is where exchange happens. So we're going to talk about levels of leakiness, okay? All right, so continuous capillaries is the first picture on the top left. Okay, so again, this is one example of a capillary, okay? You see a single layer of Endothelial cells, simple squamous epithelial tissue. You got a layer of connective tissue on the outside. There's a pericyte there maintaining the organ, and you've got one single red blood cell in there flowing by. You've got little clefts in here, which are little openings, okay? But continuous capillaries have what are called tight junctions. We've talked about tight junctions. So they're a little bit more finicky with what they allow to leak through, okay? So of the three, continuous capillaries are the least leaky. Okay, so they're the least leaky. Okay, and where do we find continuous capillaries in the body? There's three examples. Okay, we can find them in the skin. We can find them in skeletal muscle. And we can find them in the nervous system. Okay, so those are three areas of the body where we have continuous capillaries. Okay, the next in line is called fenestrated, which is the right picture here. Similar anatomy, except you add fenestrations, which are pores, and you can see there's a little bit more leakiness through those squamous cells. Okay, so there's more leakiness of this particular capillary. So this would be kind of like middle of the road. Okay. So fenestrated capillaries can be found in a couple areas of the body themselves. The first one being the small intestine. Okay, so you want a little bit more leakiness here because you want to absorb nutrients. You can find this in synovial joints. Okay, because synovial fluid is a direct derivative of what? Blood. I asked you that on an extra credit question. And then you can also find these in the kidneys. And the kidneys are your main filtering organs of your blood, so the capillaries are going to be a little bit more leaky there. Okay, so then the third type are the most leaky, and those are called sinusoids. So similar anatomy, but you've got giant gaping holes. You've got huge clefts here in between the cells, but you also have giant holes. So these are going to be the most leaky. Okay, this is where you want the most volume of exchange to occur. Okay, so two areas in the body where you can find this. First one is the spleen. And the spleen is where your red blood cells go to die. So your red blood cells are special cells. We'll talk about blood next week. But they essentially ditch all of their organelles so that they can carry more oxygen. But because they ditch all their organelles, including their nucleus, can they undergo mitosis? No. So they can't divide, so they have a shelf life. So when they finish the end of the road, they go to the spleen, and the spleen resorbs them. Okay? So another place in the body is your red bone marrow. What do you make in your red bone marrow? Blood cells, right? So you make new blood cells. So you want new blood cells to go back into the bloodstream. So you want big gaping holes there for large volume exchange. Okay? The most common capillary in the body is continuous. Okay, that's the most common type. Okay, so how does exchange happen in capillaries? Well, number one, diffusion. They're just going right down the concentration gradient. Beautiful passive transport, doesn't require any energy. Okay, you can use those intercellular clefts, so the gaps in between the cells. Those are doors wide open. Some capillaries, depending on the substance, you might use vesicles. Maybe the substances are a little large, they can't quite fit through the fenestrations or whatnot. We'll use vesicles for that. Okay, you've got the fenestrations that we were talking about. Those are additional openings. Okay, so there's multiple ways for things to get out. Plenty of exchange that can occur at the capillary level. Now, the one place in the body, okay, that has plenty of capillaries is in the brain, right? Because the brain is highly vascular and needs oxygen all the time. But we have what's called the blood-brain barrier, and the blood-brain barrier lacks any of these characteristics. The blood-brain barrier is a special barrier only found in the brain, and it only allows certain things to cross it, like oxygen, or certain kinds of drugs, like anesthesia, okay, can cross the blood-brain barrier. So it's got what we call low permeability, but that's for protection. Okay, so we're leaving a capillary, and then we enter what are called venules, small veins. Okay, small veins. So again, veins are going to have the same three tunics, but veins are going to have a much thinner tunica media. Okay, they're not under pressure like arteries are. Okay. In venules, so in these small veins, is where white blood cells leave the bloodstream to do their job, okay? So red blood cells stay in the bloodstream because their only job is to do what? What do red blood cells do? Deliver oxygen. So that's their only job, is just go from A to B, stop, oxygen jumps off, jumps on. That's the only job of a red blood cell. It does not need to leave the bloodstream. White blood cells are involved in an immune response. So white blood cells need to enter interstitial space. They need to leave the bloodstream in order to do their job. And that is called diapedesis. Okay, when they leave the bloodstream at a particular location to do their job, and that is done at the level of a venule. Okay. Okay. So then venules will converge and merge into larger veins. So for veins, the tunica externa is thicker than the media. There's less elastic overall, because again, they're under less pressure. Sinuses, which we'll cover in lab when we talk about blood vessels, but we've already talked about one sinus, which is the coronary sinus in the heart. A sinus is like a large vein that has thin walls, but these kind of veins can't dilate and constrict. They can't participate in what's called vasomotion because they don't have enough tunica media in order to do that. So these sinuses are purely just collectors of venous blood, and they have to use other avenues in order to move that blood through the tube. Okay. So, veins use valves. Arteries do not. What do valves do? Prevent backflow. So not only in the heart, but in circulation. All right? So veins use valves, and valves prevent backflow. The valves are created by the tunica intima just involuting on itself, so it's just involutions of tunica intima. So valves prevent backflow, but still, you have to have more than just valves in order to move, for example, venous blood coming from your lower extremities back up to your heart in order to get it into the pulmonary circuit for exchange. So veins like to position themselves in between and around and very near skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is going to provide the pumping action that veins need in order to push blood through the tube. Okay, because again, veins have a very thin tunica media, a lot less smooth muscle. They're not under pressure like arteries are. They're further away from the heart. Their only job is to bring blood back to the heart. So they're going to use skeletal muscle, the skeletal muscle pump. Right? when valves fail, okay, so if valves and veins fail, then you can get, coagulation of blood and collections of blood in different aspects of the veins, typically as you get older or with people that have more physical jobs where they're more on their feet a lot or doing heavy lifting or whatnot, putting more demand on their lower extremities, they can get what are called varicose veins. And varicose veins, you can undergo an outpatient procedure called stripping, where they basically can get rid of those superficial veins because you have many, many veins that can take over. It's typically the superficial ones that come up to the surface, and people don't like it, especially females. They don't like the look of it. It's old lady legs or whatever, they don't like it, so they're gonna do some venous stripping to get rid of their varicosities, so to speak, okay? So overall circulation in veins is a lot slower and is under less pressure because, again, it's further away from the heart, and their only job is to bring blood back to the heart. So great example of skeletal muscle pump is like, what do they always tell you to do if you do like an international flight for like 20 plus hours?
Your calves.
Yeah, they always say, okay, pump your calves, get up and walk up and down the aisle a couple times. Make sure you're not sitting for hours and hours on end because you don't want that fluid to pool in your legs. It reduces your circulation. Or, some of you may have heard or maybe seen, like if you're in a wedding, like the wedding party, and it's like a big Catholic wedding and it goes on forever and ever and ever, and you've got the wedding party just standing there on the stage, and they're just standing there, and they're not moving, and they're not moving, and they're not moving, and all of a sudden one of the bridesmaids, passes out. Because all that blood is pooling, and you don't see them doing these periodic, skeletal muscle pumps, and it could be hot, they could be nervous, they could be tired, maybe they didn't eat anything, and they just start dropping like flies. That's because, circulation is slowed down and all the blood is draining from the brain. Okay. Even the soldiers that do the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, they're taught to do skeletal muscle pumping because they're basically standing by that tomb 24/7, 365, standing still. So they have to do that also in order to just stay conscious, right? Okay. All right, so blood vessels, because they are organs, just like the heart, they need their own blood supply to survive. They need their own nutrients, they need to get rid of their own waste, and the blood vessels for blood vessels is called vasa vasorum. So that's the blood supply to blood vessels, okay? Anastomoses is basically a term where blood vessels, kind of like what we were talking about yesterday with the heart, blood vessels that interconnect, that form kind of like a spider web type effect. So it's kind of like if one of your coronary arteries on the heart goes down, okay, or starts to get clogged, you're gonna sprout some new ones, and they're probably gonna interlace with themselves so that they can all interconnect and help each other out. That's what an anastomosis is. So one of the coronary arteries could potentially be 90% occluded before you notice a problem because of the anastomosis and the fact that your body's creating new branches without you even knowing it. I mean, you may get little like pings and pangs of pain here and there, but it's not enough to limit you functionally in your day-to-day life, so a lot of people just ignore it. So always listen to your body. If something's unusual, get it checked out, right? Don't just assume it's okay. That includes family members and everybody else that you guys know. So now that you know so much more about the body. Okay, from here, all I really want you to know is blood vessels rely on pressure, okay? Blood pressure. So there has to be pressure in order for blood to move through the vessels, okay? The sympathetic nervous system, so the fight or flight part of the nervous system, is what controls this and monitors. So if there's not enough blood pressure, the sympathetic nervous system gets triggered to increase your heart rate. Okay, the medulla, like we said yesterday, is in control of your heart rate. So if blood pressure starts to go down, then that's going to trigger your medulla to trigger your heart to say, hey, beat faster. We don't have enough pressure. We need more pressure. Okay? And if you increase pressure, then that's going to increase venous return, which is going to bring blood back to the heart and continue normal circulation. Okay, so it's all based on pressure. That's all I want you to get out of this slide. Okay, so this is just a representation of flow, so you guys can utilize this for your studies if you like the diagram type of look to it. When we talk about respiratory system next week, we're really going to talk about this in a lot of detail. The point of gas exchange, which is basically at the depths of your lungs in structures called alveoli, and the capillaries that hug them. It's there where gas exchange and all the magic happens. So we'll talk about that later, but this is just kind of a preview. Okay, so as far as fetal circulation goes, we're going to identify a lot of structures in lab, okay? But what I want you to know is just two shunts, okay, in fetal circulation that we have that are designed to push blood to different locations, okay? So when we're talking about fetal circulation, we're talking about baby still inside mom, okay? So baby's still inside a big fluid-filled sac inside of mom, okay? So the main organ of gas exchange for a fetus is going to be the placenta, okay? So that's why they call the placenta an afterbirth, because it's typically quite a large structure, because that's the main organ of gas exchange for the fetus. So, in a fetus, in a fetal heart, okay, we have an opening that goes, this purple arrow here, we have an opening that goes in between the right atrium and the left atrium, okay? And that opening is called the foramen ovale, okay? In between the right and left atrium, and that's called the foramen ovale, okay? So think about it. The right side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood where?
Lungs.
To the lungs. In a fetus, are the lungs working yet? No. That's why the main organ of gas exchange is what? The placenta, okay? So if gas exchange is happening at the placenta, blood coming back to the heart from the placenta is oxygen rich, okay? So it doesn't need to go through the pulmonary circuit, so let's shove it into the systemic circuit. So you take it from the right and you throw it into the left, okay? Now, does some go into the right ventricle, go into the pulmonary trunk, absolutely? Yes, but then it just kind of comes right back in, okay? But a majority of the blood gets thrown into the left side, the systemic side, okay? All right. Now, another shunt that babies have is what's called the ductus arteriosus, okay? The ductus arteriosus goes from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta, okay? So, some of the blood that didn't go into the left atrium, all right, it'll go into the right ventricle, it'll go into the pulmonary trunk, and it'll want to go into the lungs, but we'll catch even more of that blood and we'll throw it into the aorta through the ductus arteriosus. Okay. So again, the whole design is to throw blood coming from the placenta that's freshly oxygenated into the systemic side. Okay, that's the whole point. Okay. What else? Okay. So coming from the placenta then, we have the umbilical cord, right? And the umbilical cord has umbilical arteries and umbilical veins, okay? What's the definition of a vein again? Takes blood back to the heart, okay? If this is the main organ of gas exchange in a fetus, the umbilical vein is going to be colored what? red, which it is, okay? It's carrying blood back to the heart, but it's freshly oxygenated, okay? Umbilical arteries are carrying blood away from the heart back to the placenta for gas exchange, so they're blue. Okay. And one last shunt here that I want you guys to know is called the ductus venosus. Okay, so you have ductus arteriosus, and now we have ductus venosus. And what ductus venosus is it takes the umbilical vein blood, which is freshly oxygenated from the placenta, and it bypasses the liver. Okay, so the liver is your main filtering organ in your body, and it filters your bloodstream. But the placenta is pure. So the placenta does all of that work for the fetus. So blood bypasses the liver and goes straight into the inferior vena cava, headed towards the right atrium via this shunt called the ductus venosus. That blood does not need to get filtered by the liver. Okay. It's pure, coming from the placenta. Okay. So once a baby's born, the minute a baby's born, that foramen ovale seals up, okay, and those ductus venosus and arteriosus become ligaments. And we'll learn those structures in lab. Okay. Okay, questions about the three shunts? That's it in terms of fetal circ for us in here. In lab, we'll identify more of the actual structures. Again, this is just supplemental information of what I just said. Yeah, it's just showing you fossa ovalis, which is an indentation post-birth. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So this is just showing you how the ductus arteriosus, well, this is a sheep brain, sorry, sheep heart. we're gonna identify, maybe identify this under dissection when we get to sheep hearts. But that ductus turns into a ligament after birth, immediately once a fetus is born. So that's all I have to say about that. Okay, so like I'm done with blood vessels. Told you guys it's very modified. So I figured you guys wouldn't want me to rattle on and lecture, and instead